Their Fellowship of Valor was created by a resolution by the Continental Congress on November 10th of 1775. The resolution ordered that 2 battalions of Marines be raised for service as landing forces with the fleet. Since then, the U.S. Marine Corps has written a long and proud chapter in military history, leaving an unequaled trail of service and distinction on both domestic and foreign soil. The Marines' earliest and most famous police action occurred against the Barbary pirates on April 27, 1805. The pirates had been raiding Western merchantmen of the North African coast. They had also seized a number of American sailors and sold them into slavery.
The Bashaw of Tripoli deposed his brother, a guy by the name of Hammett. And this guy kind of went to the United States and says, you know, I'll help you if you will help me depose my brother.
The offer was taken to President Thomas Jefferson.
The president said, well, we don't really have the manpower for that, so I'll give you what I've got. 1 Marine officer, 7 Marine enlisted.
First Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon was given command of the 7 Marines and 300 mercenaries in an effort to capture the fortress of Derna. Supported by 3 Navy ships posted offshore, O'Bannon assaulted the fort and planted the American flag on its ramparts.
He was so pleased that he gave Presley O'Bannon a sword, a beautiful sword. This sword is today the model of the sword that every officer carries. It's called the Mameluke sword.
In the Mexican-American War, a battalion of Marines joined General Scott's army at Pueblo, Mexico, and fought all the way to the halls of Montezuma when they made their legendary assault on Chapultepec Palace in Mexico City.
The Marines were spearheading the attack on the castle of Chapultepec. And when they made their amphibious assaults and they hit the Chapultepec battle, over 90% of the officers and enlisted Marines lost their lives in that battle. But they captured the castle, and of course that's the legend of the Marine Corps, from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. And basically the significance of that is the red stripe that you see on the trousers of the United States Marine Corps officers and non-commissioned officers is what we call a blood stripe. Represents the blood shed at the Battle of Chapultepec.
In the 1850s, the Marines would see further service in Panama and Asia, escorting Matthew Perry's East Indian Squadron on its historic trip to the Far East. On October 16, 1859, abolitionist John Brown attempted to seize the federal armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, and used the weapons to incite a slave uprising in the South. His plans began to unravel when President James Buchanan placed the 86 Marines based at the Washington Navy Yard under the command of Robert E. Lee of the Army and sent them to Harper's Ferry to storm Brown's position. The entire action took just over a minute. With their vast service in foreign engagements, the Marine Corps played a moderate role in the Civil War. Their most prominent task was blockade duty of the southern ports, keeping arms and supplies from reaching the rebel armies, thereby shortening the war. On the evening of February 15, 1898, the armored cruiser Maine, moored in Havana Harbor, erupted in a violent explosion. The Maine sank, killing 260 Americans, among them 28 Marines. "Remember the Maine" became the national battle cry. The Marines mobilized in record time. The 647-man 1st Marine Battalion embarked from Key West in 2 days' time. In 1898, during the Spanish-American War, Marines led U.S. forces ashore in the Philippines, Cuba, and Puerto Rico, demonstrating their readiness for deployment. At Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, the Marines seized an advanced naval base that remains in use today. Between 1899 and 1916, the Corps continued its record of participation in foreign expeditions. These experiences would hold them in good stead during the challenges they faced in the new century. The Marines grew from a sea-going constabulary to a fighting force to be feared in the Great War. In 1917, all of Europe was on the verge of bankruptcy, yet the Great War went on. Broken and war-weary, the Allies had one hope: fresh troops in America. The problem with this great tide of enthusiasm, though, was that it was based on an utterly mistaken assumption. For America, in truth, had no military might. In April 1916, the United States was as poorly prepared to go to war as any nation in history. It ranked in size 17th in the world. The U.S. Army had fewer than 135,000 troops. The U.S. Marine Corps had only a few thousand men. These troops were not organized or trained for combat, and they lacked even the most basic supplies. Yet the brash young Yanks chafed at the bit to prove themselves, and their chance would come soon enough. With the Germans advancing on the Marne in the vicinity of Chateau Thierry, Major General John Pershing, commander of the American Expeditionary Force, was ordered by Allied command to move his 2nd and 3rd Divisions into the area to shore up the French resistance there. On June 1, Marine Captain Lloyd Williams took up forward positions north of the village of Lucy-la-Bocage, near the Belleau Wood.
The Marines were asked to move in as replacements for the 2nd Army Division. All we had was a couple of regiments of Marines, so they sent in the 5th and the 6th Marine Regiment to relieve the besieged Army battalions or divisions or whatever they had in there.
When their French commanders advised them they were too far forward and should pull back, Captain Williams replied, "Retreat, hell, we just got here." On June 4th, the Germans attacked the left flank of the American lines from Belleau Wood to the north, engaging the Marines 2nd of the 5th at and around Le Maire Farm. With their artillery and machine gun support in place, the Marines repulsed the German attack. On the following day, the French command ordered the Marines to take the Belleau Wood. So eager were the Marines to go after the Germans that at 3:45 a.m. on June 6th, when the commander of the Marines reached the front line to give the attack order, many of his men already were 25 yards out and moving forward at double time.
The battle was extremely tenacious. In fact, there was one Marine they were getting pinned down, and his name was Sergeant Major Dan Daly. And Sergeant Major Daly is one of the only 2 Marines that has won the Medal of Honor twice. I say won, awarded the Medal of Honor twice. The first time was at the Battle of Belleau Wood, and as his unit was pinned down, he basically just jumped up and he said something to the effect of, "Come on, you sons of bitches, you want to live forever." And of course it inspired his men, and then he attacked machine gun positions of the enemy.
As the Marines rushed into the open green wheat field between their lines and the wood, they were met by a hail of German machine gun fire from the cover of the trees.
And they continued to push through, and finally, after some very tenacious fighting, they defeated the German and pushed the Germans back out of the Belleau Woods.
When the decimated Marine units reached the wood, they plunged in with bayonets fixed. The German troops were stunned at the ferocity of the assault.
When the Germans were captured in their interrogations, they always referred to the Marines as Teufel Hunden. And Teufel Hunden simply means devil dogs.
Because of the way they were ordered to advance across open ground, Marine casualties in the Belleau Wood on June 6, 1918 were the highest in the history of the Corps. 1,087 Marines were killed or wounded in that single day of fighting. The fight for the Belleau Wood would continue for most of the month of June. For the Marines who fought there, and for all those who would wear the uniforms after them, it was one of the Corps' proudest moments, and it showed the Germans that the Americans were ready to fight. After the Great War, Marines once again saw action throughout Central America as a police force. These actions became known as the Banana Wars due to those countries' principal export. It was also during this time that the Fleet Marines took to the air.
The emphasis on the Marine Corps and between the wars was the development of amphibious doctrine, because I think we knew that the Japanese were an imperialistic country, and basically our biggest threat was going to be that particular area, and that we would have to do some business in the Pacific in addition to the stuff we were doing in Europe.
The ability of aviation to enhance operations in trackless terrain was becoming clear to the Marine Corps through these types of expeditionary deployments. Here the Marines began to hone their skills at close air support. From the mid-20s, Marine squadrons had qualified aboard fleet carriers from time to time as part of their mission, beginning with the converted collier USS Langley. In 1936, there were 145 Marine pilots on active duty, and by mid-1940, the number had only increased to 245. By the end of 1940, Marine aviation pilot strength had risen to 425. Before the end of the war against Japan, Marine aviation had reached a total of over 10,000 pilots on active duty. December 7, 1941. Just before dawn, 270 miles northwest of Oahu, Hawaii, 181 Japanese fighters and bombers prepared to strike Pearl Harbor. The Americans, caught off guard, responded as quickly as they were able. The first scattered shots from sentries ashore and watchstanders who manned anti-aircraft guns on board ship flashed back at the enemy even before the call to arms and general quarters. Salvageable guns were stripped from damaged planes and set up on hastily improvised mounts. One scout bomber rear machine gun was manned to swell the volume of anti-aircraft fire. The Marine machine guns accounted for at least one of the enemy planes. By 9:55, the attack is over. Wake was next. Wake Island was garrisoned by elements of the 1st Marine Defense Battalion, totaling 449 officers and men, under Navy Commander Winfield S. Cunningham. The first attack on Wake occurred just before noon on Pearl Harbor Day. The Japanese strafed the airfield on Wake, blowing up 7 of the fighters still on the ground, but the remaining flying leathernecks managed to shoot down a dozen of the enemy bombers. Shortly after midnight on December 11, Marine lookouts saw a blinking light on the horizon, and by dawn, a Japanese invasion force was waiting ashore. The Marines waited until the last minute to open fire. Their 5-inch guns crippled the Ubari, flagship of the invasion force, and sunk 1 destroyer. A second destroyer was hit and sunk by 100-pound bombs from the surviving Grummons. In a 45-minute battle, a few hundred Marines had beaten back an entire Japanese invasion fleet. The remaining Japanese forces turned tail and sailed back to their base at Kwajalein. The Americans had lost only 1 man. For the first time since the beginning of the war, the Japanese had been turned back. The attack on Wake was one of the most humiliating defeats of the Imperial Navy during the war. But the Japanese would be back in force. At about 02:30 on December 21st, 2 ships ground gently ashore on the coral reef of Wake Island. Japanese naval infantrymen slipped over the side into the surf, struggled ashore, and sprinted across the coral for cover. Outmanned, outgunned, scattered bands of Marines fought on. Of the 449 Marines who manned Wake's defenses, 49 were killed, 32 were wounded, and the remainder became prisoners of war. Wake's defense in 1941 had been one of the few bright spots during the first months of the war in the Pacific. It provided Americans a stirring example of heroism at a time when heroes were sorely needed. The gallant Marines of Wake Island sacrificed themselves to buy America what it needed most: time. For 6 months, the Japanese ran wild across the Pacific. The Imperial forces knew nothing but victory. That changed with the epic Battle of Midway. After Midway, the United States launched a counter-offensive strike known as island hopping, establishing a line of overlapping island bases as well as air control.
And the island hopping campaign basically was a strategy designed by the military, by MacArthur in particular, to leapfrog the islands across the Pacific so that they could avoid the heavily fortified islands around that Japanese where they knew the Japanese were, and eventually worked their way all the way up to the Japanese mainland.
The Marines crossed the Central Pacific by way of the Gilberts, Marshalls, Marianas, Carolines, and Palaus. In a series of endless bloody battles with one goal in mind, the Japanese home islands. The volcanic island of Iwo Jima was a crucial location for the island hopping campaign to succeed. The island's proximity would make it possible for B-29 raids anywhere on the Japanese home islands.
Iwo Jima just happened to be an area where we wanted an airstrip, and we thought that it would be a fairly easy operation.
The relentless pre-invasion bombardment from naval and air forces had done little damage. While literally inching their way across the island, the Marines were able to secure Iwo Jima after 36 days of brutal combat. 22 Marines and 5 sailors received the Congressional Medal of Honor for their actions on Iwo Jima, the most bestowed for any campaign. The Battle of Okinawa proved to be the bloodiest battle of the Pacific War. 34 Allied ships and other craft of all types were sunk, mostly by kamikazes.
Okinawa was significant in that it was only 150 miles from mainland Japan. And that would have been the last stop before to secure bombing positions and, you know, an airstrip, etc., so that the main force could actually land on Japan and take the Japanese head on their own turf.
The total Marine casualties in the operation numbered more than 12,000 killed and 36,000 wounded. The morning of August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb exploded over Hiroshima. 3 days later, Nagasaki suffered the same fate. The Japanese realized that resistance was now useless. The Marines were spared the horror of an assault on the home islands. The Devil Dog's greatest campaign was over. On June 25, 1950, 8 divisions of the North Korean People's Army, equipped with Soviet tanks, mobile artillery, and supporting aircraft, crossed the 38th parallel and invaded the Republic of Korea. On June 27, the United Nations Security Council proclaimed the North Korean attack a breach of world peace and requested member nations to assist the Republic of Korea. On July 2, Commander-in-Chief Far East General of the Army, Douglas A. MacArthur, recommended that a Marine Corps regimental combat team be deployed to the Far East. The Joint Chiefs of Staff approved his request the following day. On July 7, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade was activated at Marine Corps Base Camp Pendleton, California. Just 5 days after its activation, the 1st Provisional Marine Brigade, with a strength of over 6,500, sailed from San Diego en route to Busan, Korea. The first elements of the brigade came ashore at Busan on August 2. On September 15, the legendary 1st Marine Division led the first major UN force strike in North Korean occupied territory, with a surprise amphibious assault at Incheon.
That was kind of a tenuous operation, to say the least, because apparently Incheon has a very shallow port, and it restricts the use of amphibious operations to a few hours a day. So you had to, number one, time your landing, and then when they got there, I think that instead of landing on a beach, they literally had to scale walls to get there.
In 5 days of textbook-style campaigning, the division broke out and closed on the approaches of Seoul, the South Korean capital. By September 27, in house-to-house fighting, the Marines wrested the city from its communist captors. In late October, the 1st Marine Division made an unopposed landing at Wonsan on the east coast, which initiated UN operations in northeast Korea and established security for the port of Wonsan. The division was then ordered to advance northwest of Hungnam along a mountain road to the Chosin Reservoir, the site of an important hydroelectric plant. Despite intelligence in early November that Chinese Communist forces were massing in force across the Yalu River, the 1st Marine Division was ordered to continue its progress northwest from Hungnam to the Chosin Reservoir. On November 27, elements of the Chinese Communist People's Liberation Army struck Marine positions in force. In a carefully planned counterstroke, 8 Chinese divisions charged down from surrounding mountains with the express mission of destroying the Marines.
Literally, the Chinese surrounded the Marines, the 1st Marine Division, up near the Chosin Reservoir, up in the mountains. It's a guy by the name of Chesty Puller that you might have heard of, and Chesty Puller is kind of a legend in the Marine Corps. He's the most decorated Marine that ever lived. He had 52 personal decorations, including 5 Navy Crosses. And it is said, probably out of context and maybe embellished a little bit, that that he was calling into headquarters, and they asked him for a situation report, and he says, I got Chinese communists on my right, I got Chinese communists on my left, I got them in my front, and I got them in my back. Them bastards won't get away from us this time.
Major General O.P. Smith, commanding general of the 1st Marine Division, ordered Colonel Chesty Puller to send a task force to open up the road between Koto-ri and Hugaru-ri, where the majority of the division was. This force became the spearhead of a remarkable fighting withdrawal.
And he proceeded to do a retreat out of the out of the Chosin Reservoir, took the whole 1st Marine Division in the middle of winter and moved them all the way back to Incheon. Took a while and a lot of casualties, but basically fought his way all the way back. And that's exactly what he did. They didn't get away from him.
At 10 p.m. on July 27, 1953, the lengthy truce negotiated at Panmunjom finally went into effect, ending 3 years of fighting in Korea. The Marine Corps emerged from the Korean War with the highest sustained peacetime strength in its history. In little over a decade, that force would be put to the test once again in Southeast Asia.